The first thing I wanted to mention before we, let me just find my cursor. The first thing I wanted to mention before we start the lecture is that I know a lot of you have data processing still to do, and you'll have lots of model engineering still to do. However, you may not get to a point where you need to ask the TAs questions. And so if you are thinking about like, oh, what type of analyses should I run? What type of model should I build? You can definitely have those like theoretical conversations with them right now and ask them how they would go about approaching it. Because even if you don't get there today, you should definitely utilize their expertise and, ask them how they would build certain models given the type of data that you have. So definitely make sure to ask them questions even if you don't need them immediately right now. Okay, with that, let's start the Model Engineering Principles lecture. And you all look a little tired post-lunch, but there will be lots of questions, so pay attention. All right, so this is going to follow very similarly to the first lecture, which was on data set processing. And so what I'm going to start with is asking you guys, what are your model engineering principles? And they may not be codified, and that's fine. They might be rough, but when you have data and you want to analyze it, you want you apply dimensionality reduction, what do you do with it? Like, what are your principles? UA.
I actually need to understand the assumptions that model makes first, whether the assumptions are actually, whether they're suitable to my theoretical assumptions of the data.
Okay, good. Did you guys all hear that? Okay. What else? Okay, no, that's a good one. That's a good one. I mean, like, simple things are important too. Like, what exactly are you plotting? What exactly are you trying to understand? What exactly are you trying to dimensionality reduce? Okay, I see. Yes, Jay.
There's a rule called outcomes razor.
Mm-hmm.
You try to model your data in many ways. Usually the simplest answer is the best.
Yeah. Yeah, so for those of you that didn't hear, so Jay referenced Occam's razor, which is the simplest solution is often the right solution. All right, so these are all very good principles, and you guys are clearly tired. There will be lots of questions, so don't worry. So what we're going to do now is we're going to walk through some of the principles that I have when I'm looking at model engineering. These are, again, in no way all-encompassing of everything that you might want to take into account when you're building a model, but these are some, and it's a good start for those of you that are trying to build your own with the data you brought today. Okay, so the first one is GIGO, which is very common in like engineering circles. So garbage in, garbage out. Does somebody want to tell me what I mean by this? Somebody that like doesn't know. I want, who said, was that Brady? Did you say something?
I didn't, but I could.
Sure, go for it.
That if you have, bad data or whatever, you're not going to get anything to look at it.
Exactly. So Brady said it, if you put bad data in, you're not going to get anything. Like if there's no signal and there's like too much noise, you're not going to learn anything. So this is going to bleed very, like the data processing lecture that we just had is going to bleed into this because there's always going to be some tight connection between what your data does and what your modeling is. So these first few topics are going to be like, oh, should that have gone in the data lecture? And there's a debate, but make sure to know that like there's always this communication between the data, what it can do, and the model and what you can build. Okay, the next one is KISS, or keep it simple stupid. And this is another important principle. If you can do something linearly and you do not need a neural network, don't use a neural network. If you can, do the simplest thing you possibly can first. You should only like go up a level in terms of complexity or like depth of your network or even using a neural network if the most simple linear solution does not work. One of the things that Isong will actually often say is that when he has people that rotate from like the biology side of things, they'll want to jump straight into using a neural network. And he's like, wait, have you tried PCA? Have you tried SVD? Have you done these simple things? Because if the simplest thing answers your question, there's literally no need to use it. You just add uncertainty, you add nonlinearity, you lose interpretability. It doesn't make sense. So always try the simple thing first, and we're gonna see some examples where that does work, and then we're gonna see some examples where that doesn't work, and we do actually need to use something more complicated because the data warrants it. All right. The next thing, which is a little bit difficult, but this is an important concept to grasp, if the simple stuff doesn't work, the hard problems are hard because picking the right model, also known as the architecture, is hard. And so I think on Friday last week, there was a little bit of discussion in the lecture I gave on what, convolutional neural networks are good for, which are often canonically images, what recurrent neural networks are good for, which is often sequences. These are not the most simple model architectures. And in the next few days, Chethan and Eva and Jonathan are gonna walk you through these more complicated architectures and explain like how does an RNN or recurrent neural network work. And so you're gonna see this a little bit more. But if the simple stuff doesn't work, it's probably because even like the way your data is organized requires something that uses domain expertise, whether or not that be pixels close to one another share information so we can convolve across them, or sequences in time or like in text, for instance, are similar, and so there's information we can use for neighbors. And so we're gonna walk through an example of how one might go about thinking about an architecture using the data set I walked you guys through this morning. But don't fret that if the simple thing doesn't work, the question and the problem is actually very difficult.
I have a question.
Yes.
This is just kind of may seem like a naive or out there one, but typically if you're writing a paper, if you're doing model comparison, you take into account the number of parameters that you're using in your models. Obviously, it's not even a question when you get to these more complicated models or the more difficult architectures. Is there a way to penalize for complexity, or is that just like not even a factor to consider?
Yeah, so some people certainly do compare the number of parameters used in neural networks. I think it really does depend on the task that you're trying to do. Like, you never want your network to obviously overfit, so you don't want to have like so many parameters that it can just like memorize the data set. I don't think that, it depends if you're talking about like the machine learning field proper, or perhaps the more computational neuroscience or like computational biology field. I'm not really aware of parameter count by itself being penalized, but certainly interpretability is something that's penalized, and that's related to number of parameters and how interpretable it is. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? All right. The next one is something we've touched on as well. It's your representation is only as good as your target task. And we chatted about this, and I think there was some like confusion about why having a representation that can be used for many downstream tasks is important. So we're actually going to spend a lot of time on this particular principle so that you guys can see what I mean by a shared representation that can answer many questions is actually valuable for you. And that bleeds into one of the future points as well, which is modularity. And speaking of which, emphasizing modularity, and there is a big exception with the machine learning side of things, that is important as well. And what I mean by emphasizing modularity is you're gonna have many pieces of either your data processing or model engineering pipeline that need to output something that stands alone and then gets sent to another network. So you have to be very clear about, what am I outputting? Am I outputting like neurons by time, or like time by neurons, or like by participants by days? You have to be very clear not only with how you handle the data, but also if we go back to our autoencoders lecture from last week, your encoder takes in data and it reduces it to something. Your decoder expects that data in like a similar format such that it can process it and generate a reconstruction. So you have to think about like what pieces of the model that I'm building are modular, how can I combine them, how could I like plug and play like a different model, or with an autoencoder, perhaps I don't even want that decoder, I just want to take the representation. So you can think about modularity not only in like data to modeling, but also in terms of models and how models connect to other models, or how models connect to downstream tasks. And I believe the last one that we're going to touch on today is ground truth, baselines, and reproducibility. And this is a very important concept in modeling. I know you guys built a neural network with me last Friday, and when we did that neural network, some of you, I think it was Manchuan, asked questions about like, oh, how do I know that this actually works? And the answer was, oh, you actually have to do it on many different model seeds. You have to train the network 5 times on 5 different seeds with like 5 different data distributions or 5 different data splits to know whether or not it works. And so this concept of reproducibility is important. And what you guys have learned so far is like how to build it and how to get it working. But if you actually want it to make sure that it works on your data set and it's going to generalize, you have to do more work, more engineering work to figure out, like, does this actually make sense with all the data that I'll have, and is it reproducible? Okay, these are the 6 topics we're going to cover today. Does anyone have any questions? No? Okay. All right, let's start with garbage in, garbage out. So this is the data set that we walked through before this morning, where the top is 12 human patients that have electrodes, and we've basically got the Montreal Neurological Institute Atlas, and we've put all 12 on top of one another. And then the middle image just shows how you have multiple patients. Each patient has multiple days. Each day has multiple electrodes that are active or inactive, and then each electrode has multiple time series. And on the bottom, what I'm doing is I'm showing one patient's worth of electrodes, just so that you guys can kind of visualize how it fits in. Now, if I take this data, and for each patient, I flatten the data along days and electrodes. So it's like this tensor, and I just flatten it, and I put it through PCA. What do you guys think is going to happen? What do you think I'm going to get? Yeah, so basically, yeah, so like think of it as I have like one tensor for each patient, where the tensor for a patient is like the number of days, the number of electrodes, the number of time series instances I have. So this might be a tensor of like, there's 7 days by like 100 electrodes by 1,000 time series. So I take this tensor, this data tensor for each patient, and I take that tensor, and you guys learned how you can flatten a matrix into a vector. Let's say I take that tensor and I flatten it, and I want to get a representation like for what the patient is in the lower dimensional space, and I want to do it with PCA. What do you think I'm going to get? Yeah, Jayu.
If you have all the patients all together, you probably end up just having information about like measurements from the electrode, which are not at the same location for everyone over days, and that would be just garbage in.
Yeah, so in the ideal world, you're right. I would get something where the patients have been normalized to each other, which we talked about in the last lecture. We haven't gotten standardized data. We have different electrode locations. So yeah, that's one option. Anybody else? Does the question setup make sense? Do you guys understand that I have like this tensor, I'm flattening it, and then that flattened tensor is going into like principal components analysis? Does that make sense to everyone? Yeah? Okay. All right. So Jayu alluded to it, and I will show you guys what you get. But before I do that, I want to emphasize that here you're taking many, many, many degrees of variability, and you're trying to embed that variability into something that is linear and is going to try the most simple way to account for all this variability that is in these patients. And as Jayu mentioned, they have different days that are active. They have a different number of days. They not only have different numbers of electrodes, but they have different, locations of electrodes. And then in addition to that, there are different numbers of time series and different distributions of the behaviors that we're actually capturing because it's a naturalistic data set. So if I do this and I try to pass this data into PCA, I'm going to get garbage. And I have done this, and you do get garbage. Even if I take one patient for one day on one electrode, and I take that entire time series and I try to pass it into this, I get garbage. Because the data is very, very complex. It is very hard to understand, and PCA gives you nothing that resembles anything useful. Just want to let that sit for a second. So you're going to get garbage if you try this. However, okay, well, this kind of bleeds into the keep it simple stupid. However, let's say I have this neural data set, which we dealt with on day one, where you have the mouse, you have different visitors, and you have, I think it was like 115 neurons across time. What happens here if I try to use like a convolutional neural network? So this is, you guys will become more familiar with this later this week, but a convolutional neural network is basically you have some filter that it will work on this set of data. This filter slides across and it reduces the data. And then you have more filters that keep reducing the data until you have like a single linear layer that will make a prediction for, let's say, whether or not there's a female or male in the cage. What do you guys think you'd get if I did this? Yes. So this graph is a caricature for like a convolutional neural network. And so basically, if you guys remember, we can pull up the other slides. What a convolutional neural network will do is it has a filter that would slide over this neural data. So it would, let's say there's a square this big, and it multiplies all this neural data together, and it makes it smaller by some factor. So I could take in, a square that's like 9 by 9, and I'll just like reduce it to 4 by 4 or something like that. And so what this CNN architecture is doing is it's basically saying, okay, I have this filter up here that's being applied to this data set. I'm reducing that, and then I have another filter that goes over that reduction, and then I reduce it further, and then I reduce it further, so on and so forth, until I hit a linear layer where I want to output, whether or not there's a male or female intruder in the cage. So in this case, I have a data set that you've already analyzed, so you know what's in this data set and you know like what you can see, and I'm putting a very complicated neural network with it. What do you think you're going to get? UA?
Very hard to interpret results.
Yeah, so you're going to perhaps get very hard to interpret results. What's another option for what you might get out of this? Who said that? Okay, yeah, so that's a good guess. But other than hard to interpret results, you might get something along the lines of memorization, because you're taking a very complicated neural network and you're giving it data that like we've already analyzed with PCA, and we see that like, you can do a good job with just, simple linear transformations. So Manchuan is right, you indeed do get garbage, because your data is being like, you're asking a very complicated model to do something relatively simple with a data set that is clean, it's understood, like these degrees of variability can be captured linearly. And so it doesn't make sense to use such a complicated network with such a simple set of data. So you're going to get garbage. However, what happens if you take this data and you do PCA with it? And we've done this, so I know you all know the answer to this question. So Thomas, what do you get with this?
Pretty good way to analyze this data.
Yeah, so if we did this and you all have done this, you're going to get like very good components, and you're going to see that in the case where you have like a female intruder or a male intruder, you get something that's actually very separable and linearly separable. So using both the garbage in, garbage out, and the keep it simple, stupid approaches, I think what I want to really emphasize here is that you have data and you have many different models. The complexity of your data should match the complexity of your model. And if you take something that's very complicated, like this, and you try to use a very simple model, you're going to get garbage. You're going to get something that you don't even know how to interpret it. If you take something that's very simple, on the other hand, data-wise, and you pair it with a very complicated model, you're also going to get garbage, because the model is either going to memorize your data set, or you're going to get something that is just like not interpretable because it's solving a task that is linearly interpretable, but you're making it nonlinear for no reason. So you should always strive to match the complexity of your model with the complexity of your data, and vice versa. And so in an ideal world, you have a relatively simple data set, you use a relatively like well understood technique, and then you get some interpretation that's very clearly understood. So with garbage in, garbage out, and keep it simple, stupid, definitely match the complexity of data with the complexity of models. Yes?
But when we try to linearly separate the attack clouds,
Yeah.
we weren't able to do that.
Okay, so you weren't able to linearly separate the attack clouds because of two things, and we're going to get to this. So when you're looking at attack is only a label that appeared when the male mouse was in the cage. If we had instead gone and looked at the data, so let's say, so I don't think I have the visualization, but you remember how there was like the rainbow thing where it showed that this cluster was the female cluster and this cluster was the male cluster, and attack only showed up here. If we had instead gone and we had tried to do PCA only with the male mouse like data, we might have seen something where there was like an attack cloud and like an other cloud. And we can definitely go back and we can try that and we can see if it's possible. And so with the linearly separability, if you're using something that has multiple labels as we did, and you're trying to see like, oh, is there separation between like these two things, but then you're adding like another label that supersedes it, you might get something where it's not linearly separable in 3 dimensions. Of course, we could do it in 4 dimensions, and we can run like linear regression or logistic regression and see if it could do it using sex and the attack labels and the entirety of time to like make it possible. But if you want to, I'm happy to run through that afterwards, and we can see if it's linear separable with attack. Yeah, does that make sense? Okay. All right. Is this clear to everyone? Match your data to your model complexity and vice versa. Yeah. Okay.
I have a question.
Yes.
Why by principle would it make it worse?
Why?
Without clean data?
Oh, sorry. Say that again.
Why by principle, if you have, even if it's a clean, completely separated data, why would it spit out garbage?
Sorry. In this case.
Yeah.
So it's garbage in a different way. So in one way, if you're using a very complicated model to learn a very simple data set, like pretty much any convolutional neural network that I gave you to do the task that we did on Monday, where we just take this data set and learn it, it will be so complex that it will memorize the data set. There's no such thing as learning in that case, because it's just going to memorize it. Like even the most...
So it's a case of overfitting to a ridiculous degree.
Right.
Yeah.
Because, so that's one way it can be garbage. The other way is because you're introducing nonlinearities into a data set where you can use like just linearities to explain something. And so there's no point, if you don't get any additional representation power, to add like a lack of interpretability into the problem. So for those two reasons, that's why it's garbage. And it's a different like way of being garbage than in the first case, where here we just get something that we don't know how to interpret at all. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Any other questions?
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah.
When you're, obviously in like a perfect world, we have like unlimited time to try all the different methods.
Yeah.
How do you kind of know whether you should probably skip PCA and just go to like a more complex model or vice versa?
Yeah. So the answer that many of the professors will give you is that you never skip PCA and you never skip SVD and you always do it.
Still, like,
No, I get it. So when you're trying out, and this is actually something, and we're going to dive into, some of the examples are going to be literally on the data set from this morning, and that's stuff that like I've worked with. And so I cannot tell you how many meetings I've had with professors at Caltech where there's just like, oh, have you done this? And like, does it work and does it make sense? And so everyone is always going to ask you, have you done PCA and have you done SVD and does it work? I would say for PCA, because you don't have to implement it yourself and because there are packages that exist and because it takes a relatively quick time to train and run, there's not really a downside to just setting up a script on Colab and just running it. It like, depending on your data, it's not going to take that long. I wouldn't recommend, so on the human data, I would not recommend running PCA on like this top data set or even like for like all patients, all days, do not do that. What I would say is like, if you have a very complicated, tons of data, like terabytes of data set, pick the simplest case, see if you get something interpretable, and if you do, you can go from there, and if you don't, then you've basically proven like this doesn't make sense. Even in the simplest case, I'm not gonna bother with it. And even as I said, like with this slide, I kind of said, oh, what if you take the entire tensor and you flatten it and it doesn't work? even if I took the most simple case, which is just for one patient, for one day, for one electrode, like all the instances versus time, it still doesn't work. So I know it's like a lost cause. Yeah. Okay. Does that make sense? Any other questions? All right. Okay, the next one. So the simple stuff doesn't work. If the simple stuff doesn't work, the hard problems are hard because picking the right model, i.e. the architecture, is hard. And so we're not going to dive into this principle too much, but I do want to give you an example of what I mean. And so we've been walking through this human data set where you've got the 12 patients all in the same, like, MNI atlas space. They've got days, they've got electrodes, they've got time. Like, this is a very hard data set to analyze. And because it's a very hard data set to analyze, you can probably assume that there aren't a ton of models that are equipped to do this type of like neuroscientific data. And indeed, you are right. What we actually had to do to handle this data set is, and then this is the data set again, what we had to do to handle this data set is we actually had to create a modeling framework that specifically dealt with the fact that patients have different locations of electrodes. Patients have different days that are, even recorded. Some patients had 3 days, some patients had 5 days, like it was not uniform. And moreover, some patients did not have the same number of electrodes or even in the same location, and then they had different time series instances, often different across electrodes. And so to give you an idea, you can create this model framework where you have your data. So here it's like the electrodes on the brain. You can create this data tensor where it's electrodes by days by time. And in this participant-specific case, you can try to fit a model that will actually take in this partial data, impute and or fill in this missing data, and that's how you train it to do this task. To do this task of trying to like put all the patients in like one spot to impute all of their missing data, which is a problem in and of itself. And so we're not going to dive in. I'm happy to talk about it like offline, but we're not going to dive into this too much. But what I wanted to demonstrate is that in this task, we did not even have a baseline in the community that we could compare against. So what we had to do is we had to develop a linear baseline that made sense with this problem of like imputation across patients, across days, across electrodes, across time. And so we had to like make this baseline, and then we had to use deep learning approaches, and in this case, a CNN autoencoder to actually fill in and do this problem. And everything I've outlined so far in this data imputation problem across patients and days and electrodes and time, everything here you see is a single participant case, meaning this model only works for one participant at a time. So we had to do even further like model complication to actually make it work for multiple participants at the same time. And so again, I'm not going to go into it too much, but basically in this network, we have a single layer that will take in the very different tensors across patients. And the single layer is trained like for each patient. It shares this like inner convolutional neural network autoencoder, and then you can actually output a single layer, and that trains, that basically fills in the missing data tensor for each of the patients. So this is a little bit outside of the scope. We can dive in if you like, but all I want to say is that if there is a difficult problem and you don't have an easy linear solution, and even the more simple nonlinear solutions do not answer the question, it's probably because there are not architectures that already exist to answer your question. And so definitely keep in mind, always are there analogs that exist in like the neuroscience field or even the computational biology field that allow me to take my question, transpose it onto another question, and use the techniques that they use to solve it. And sometimes the answer is yes. And if you do time series data, you can look at how, like economists deal with their time series. Sometimes if you have like single cell sequencing data, you can see like how other instances of like single instances and like images are dealt with. And sometimes there are model similarities, but sometimes just the architectures are too hard and the question you want to answer can't be answered without doing more research in like the ML space. Okay. Yes, Nina.
So was the goal here was to generate more data?
So the goal here, yeah, so I mean, there's a few things. So there's a goal of having like a single model that can share a representation across all 12 patients that have like very different electrode coverage. The goal here was really to do reconstruction with these missing and imputed datas. Yeah, so I can send you the paper. It's called deep neural imputation. So like how can you do this imputation across patients, across days, across times in a joint representation space and actually fill in this missing data in this way. Yeah.
Was it actually to your advantage to use other participants as well with this, to have a joint participant model versus doing it with participants?
So there's a figure on that in the paper, and I will let you look at the figure, and you can see if you can answer it, and then I will answer it once you've looked at the figure. Okay. All right. Let's keep moving forward. Okay, so we're going to spend some time on this. Woo! We're going to spend time on this, so everyone should pay attention because I am going to call on people that I haven't called on yet. So Margarita, Laura, Manchuan, everyone, I'm going to call on you. Okay, so this was something, especially Laura, since you had questions about this last time, and I don't think I gave a satisfactory answer for you. Okay, so your representation is only as good as your target task, and you really need to think about this when you're modeling. Okay, so what we're going to do right now is we're going to play a game called How Good Is This Representation? And so the first thing that I want to describe is this metric that we're going to use to see how well our representation is. So the question is, how well can we solve the task with the representation that we have? And there's going to be some axis of how good this representation can solve this task. So is the representation efficiently solving the task? Is it solving the task so-so? Or is the representation, like, can we not solve the task at hand with the representation that we have? So is it not possible? Okay. So in round one, I'm going to ask the question, what is the species? And so we're going to explore this. A friend of mine, if you know Jennifer Sun, who's great, she's one of Isong's students as well, she explores this question with cats. We're going to explore this question with dogs. So if the idea is that I have dogs, I want to classify dogs, and I want to ask the question, what is the species? What is the representation that you want for this task? So, and there are many, and I want to hear many representations because there's many that we're going to put on the board. All right, I know you guys all know some representations. So what are the representations we can use for this? Actually, you ain't no. Someone else. We'll get to you if no one else says anything. All right, Waylon, what do you got?
Sound.
Sound. Okay. Yeah, like an audio clip of what the animal does. Yeah, that's a good one. What else?
Shape.
Shape. Okay. So shape meaning like words that describe the shape of the animal, like long tail, like a sentence.
Or like, just like the 2D section, for example, from like the side.
Okay, so like an image of the shape of the animal. Okay. All right, what else? So we've got sound, we've got an image of like the animal on its side. What else? Margarita, do you have one? Yeah, okay, so like a text description of what the animal is, like, you know, I don't know, is it more likely to be awake at night or more likely to be awake in the day, or it's colorblind, some type of description. What's the most simple one that we can have? It's the most simple representation.
Like size and weight.
Okay, so Sam said size and weight, so that's something, yeah. Is that the most simple though? What else? Someone said something in the audience.
I'm also sure if I get it, so like the species name.
The species name? Yeah? No, so that's good. All right. Any other ideas? No?
Is this a dog? It could be like whether this one has a black nose or something.
Yeah? Okay, so descriptions of like what it is.
Just a label of whether it has.
Yeah. So I think you both kind of said it right there at the end. So what if we just had the word dog? Like, that's a representation. It's a really efficient representation, and it answers the question about what the species is. And one of the other ones you guys suggested was effectively a picture of the animal. So like we could have a picture of the animal. So that picture, so for this task specifically, like it's it's got more information than we need. So it's not the most efficient, but we can definitely use this representation to solve the task that we have. And I would probably put sound probably somewhere in here, like somewhere between not possible and so. Like there are probably, I mean, we've probably all seen these videos where like cats will like bark like dogs or dogs will like kind of meow like cats depending on how they've been socialized. So it's probably not as good as a picture of the animal, but it's definitely not impossible to use that representation to characterize this task. Does this make sense to people? How we're placing these representations and how they can all solve this task? Okay. All right, so the next question that I want to ask, which is round 2, is what is the color of the dog? What are the representations that you'd want to solve this task?
Pixel color?
Yeah, pixel color, that's a good one. It's like the literal color of the pixels. What else?
Species or the type of dog?
Yeah, so species or type of dog, that's a good one too. Laura, do you have one? Yeah, name of the color. So more granular than what Nina said. Yeah, so I mean, a lot of these answers are right and a lot of them are similar to what we had before. So if you take the first one, like we could have dog. We could have the same label because, you know, that's just the label of what this animal is. But this very efficient representation in the first case is no longer possible to solve this new task in the second question, in the second round, if we wanted to change like the task that we have for our data. And so the representation of dog, despite the fact that it was like the most efficient representation in the first case, it no longer cannot ask or like cannot answer the second question that we give to it. Versus if you have the picture of the dog, it's still a so-so like representation in terms of efficiency, but it can still solve the task. And then lastly, and Nina had said this one, you can have each pixel color of the image. So within like the image that we have of each dog, you literally have like the RBG code for what the pixel is. And so that very efficiently solves the task, but perhaps it can't solve the other questions that one might want to ask with this data or with the representation of this data. And so I think you guys kind of understand by now that what we would want to do is we would want to use this representation because despite the fact that it's not the most efficient way to solve each of the tasks that we have, it's the best representation of the ones that we've put up that solve multiple tasks in an efficient enough manner. Does this make sense to people?
Can we use different representations for different tasks?
So you definitely can use different representations for different tasks. One thing that I will say about that though is, let's say you have a data set that is like a terabyte, or you have a data set that is like millions of images, which exists today. You do not want to rerun that data processing every time you need to answer a new question with your data, because oftentimes it will take weeks to do. And like even like the neuroscience data that like you guys must run, like I can't imagine that you'd want to go through that entire data processing stack, especially if it's not like operationalized to the point where you press a button, come back a day later, and it's done. So it makes sense to get representations that you don't need to keep rerunning, especially if it's like, you know, another few megabytes that you have to save, but it lets you solve more tasks. Okay. Yeah, Sam.
So we're looking for like one representation, like one type of, just one most comprehensive representation.
Yeah, so you certainly, and this goes to Amit's question, you don't need to have one representation. Like let's say you have a data set and you want to answer like 5 different questions about the data set. You are certainly welcome to pre-process your data 5 different times to get the 5 most efficient representations. But when it comes to modeling and when it comes to, you know, using processed data to answer your modeling questions, it makes sense to pick an efficient representation. And so that's the idea that I'm trying to convey here, where You can answer multiple questions. This picture of the dog is not the most efficient, but it does a good job of answering the 2 questions that we've posed, as well as other questions that one might pose about this data set. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. All right. So in the end, we like this representation because it works for many tasks and it's cute. Okay. All right. I think that makes sense. Okay, emphasize modularity. And we're a little short on time, so we'll go quickly. So how would you guys implement modularity in your development pipeline? And I'll give you a hint that we literally just did this. So you all know the answer. Jiling, how about you? How would you implement modularity in your development pipeline?
Try to find some representation that can be used for different questions.
Yeah, so that's good, and that is something that we literally just did, so yes. What else? Okay. All right, I will go through it then. So Jiling is right. A big example that people use a lot, and a recent example, because we just did it, is representations that, once built, can be used for many downstream tasks. Another one, which you guys are all very familiar with, is separating the data processing pipeline from your model development pipeline. And so Lior also alluded to this a little bit yesterday, where he said you don't want to like process the data, to the point where you're kind of averaging across conditions that don't make sense just because it eases the modeling. You want to make sure that you're doing something when you're processing your data. You want to make sure that you have a pipeline that makes sense and that you're not processing the data specifically into like modeling what you want to see in the data. That's also not what the goal is. All right. With these 2 examples, I'm going to give you a big exception. And this is perhaps more of a big exception in the machine learning community than in the computational neuroscience community, but it's important to be aware of it. And the exception is that in machine learning, end-to-end modeling is all the rage. And this allows the model to learn the data features to solve the task without intervention. And what I mean by end-to-end modeling is that what you can do is take your data, you don't have to do data processing to it, or you do minimal data processing to it, and you pass it in to a neural network, and the neural network will actually learn all the features that it wants to use to do the task that you give it. So you don't have to do any type of feature engineering. You don't have to do any type of understanding of what are the features that are important in your data set. This will just do it for you. And so there's lots of large language models that you guys have probably heard about that do this. There's lots of imaging models that will do this. And so I don't think that you guys will have to be worried about that too much with the modeling that you're doing, but recognize that with this emphasized modularity point, there is a very large exception that people are actually very interested in and exploit a lot, especially in the machine learning community. Okay, moving forward, this is going to be about ground truth, baselines, reproducibility, and how this is important in modeling. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to look at a figure in a paper, in the paper that deals with the data that we analyzed this morning. And I want you guys to tell me what is ground truth, what are the baselines, and what is the reproducibility that we're looking at. So we're going to look at I'm going to put up the image, we're going to look at it, I'm going to explain what's going on a little bit, and then I want you to tell me what is the ground truth, what is the baselines, what is the reproducibility. Okay, so let me start by explaining what we're looking at. So it's the same data set that you guys have seen before. On the bottom, on the x-axis, it's the participant ID, so 1 through 12. On the y-axis, it's the absolute accuracy of the model performance. And so what we're looking at here, and this is the blue is our model, and the yellow is a model that we've deleted data from. So what we've done here is at different percentages of missing data, so 50%, 70%, and 90%, we've taken this data and we've deleted it. And then this model that we built, it will actually fill in your missing data. So we fill in the missing data, and then we want to see the performance. And the task that we're running with it is to classify the move or rest, like neural decoding performance. So basically with the yellowy orange ones at different levels of missing percent of data, we've taken the original data that would be used to like classify move or rest. We've deleted the data, and then we've said, okay, now that we've deleted X% of the data, how well can we classify move or rest? Now what the blue does is it takes that yellow data that has deleted some missing data, we fill it back in with what our model can impute, and then we have it repeat the task and say, how well can we decode move or rest? Does that make sense? Do people understand what's going on here in this figure? Okay, so now that we understand what's going on, I'm going to just put up the data for all 12 participants, and I want you guys to tell me in this figure, what is the ground truth, what is the baseline, and what is like the reproducibility? And maybe let's start with the first one. So what is the ground truth here?
Actually, just a question.
Yeah.
Yellow is deleted, blue is filled back in. Is the ground truth, is the red line the original before you delete it?
Yes, so the red line is the original accuracy, which is indeed what is the performance before you have deleted any data. So in Brady's, yeah, so
That's
you,
what you're hoping to get back up.
yeah, if you can. I mean, we've deleted 50% data at least, but yes. Okay, so but then Brady, keep going for me. So what does that mean? What is that?
Maybe that's the ground truth.
Yes, so does everybody understand what Brady said and what that means and what it looks like? No, okay. So Brady, why don't you explain it one more time and loudly, and we're gonna see if people that didn't get it can understand what's going on.
Sure. So you got a data set, you're deleting parts of it and then filling it back in with your model and trying to see how much you can recover your original performance before you deleted the data. And I guess the red dotted line is the original performance.
Yeah. Okay, does that make sense now, Antoine? No? Okay, ask a question. What's the question you have? You don't get the point of ground truth? Okay, so the point of ground truth is when you're doing an experiment, whether or not it involves modeling or just like some experiment, you want to know what the original performance is because you want to know how well am I doing compared to like the ideal case. So in the ideal case, I have this array of data. Let's say it's electrodes by time. And I can take this array of data, and if I pass it through some model, it'll tell me, am I moving or am I resting? That's what it'll do. And so how well the original data does that is important because when we then delete data, we want to know like, okay, how well am I actually doing? When I delete 50% of the data, am I like completely trashing my performance or am I still doing pretty well? And then if I then add some addition to that, so I add some like modeling, so I add the modeling and I fill in the data, am I doing better? Like, do I get back to ground truth? Like, do I get back to my original data that I was using to do this task? Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So Brady is right. That is ground truth. Does that make sense to everyone?
The green, white, and the orange.
Yeah, okay. So we don't need to focus on it too much, but the green is whether or not our model outperforms. So our model meaning the blue when we refill back in the accuracy. So the blue, does the blue outperform the yellow? The yellow shading in the background is when the yellow actually outperforms the blue. And then the gray, which is, yeah, it's about equal. Yeah. Okay.
10. It looks like.
Yeah.
10, what does 10 look like?
The blue is above the yellow, but it's still white in the background.
We're gonna get to this. You are noting something important and we're gonna get to this. Okay, but let me go in order. What's the baseline? So Brady already correctly deduced that the red is the ground truth. What's the baseline? Sorry? The random, what's the random? The black line. So the baseline, I think you could argue it that way. That's not what I was thinking, but Random is more random chance. So random chance isn't really a baseline. Okay, perhaps it.
Before you fit.
Yeah, so that's what I was thinking. I think you could probably argue it both ways though. So random chance is basically what would happen. I only have 2 classes. The data set is balanced. So I only have move and rest. There's 50% move, 50% rest. So chance performance on this task is always going to be 50%. So that is random. So you could argue that that's a baseline. Alternatively, you can say that when we delete the data from the model and we don't know what's happening, what is like the zero field accuracy, which is the yellow, and I would argue that that's also a baseline. And I think the context in which they're baselines actually depends. So I would argue that the black line is a baseline for the ground truth, which is the red lines, and I would argue that the yellow or orange filled like items, so the stars or the squares or the triangles, that is a baseline for the blue performance of the same. So there's actually 2 baselines here, or you could argue that there are 2 baselines here.
Sorry.
Yes.
What exactly does zero fill accuracy?
Yeah, so the context for this is I have this array, so it's number of electrodes by time. And what I can do is I can pass this array into a neural network, and it will tell me whether or not the patient is moving or resting. So it just gives you a classification. The red line is what happens when I just take a full data matrix and I pass it in. So that's like baseline performance. The zero filled is what happens if I randomly choose, let's just keep the 50% case, I randomly delete 50% of the data and I just zero fill it. It's filled with zeros, or random 50%.
Okay, so that's, so, right, so it's a combination between the shape, which gives you the percentage of what, how
Yeah.
you're doing that, operation, and the color is telling you that it's, yeah, so 50% would be 50, 70% would be
70% deleted.
Okay, 70%.
Yeah, yeah. And then 90% is 90% deleted, which are zero filled. Yeah. Okay, does that make sense?
Yep.
Does it make sense to everyone? So everyone understands what ground truth is and what the baseline is? Okay. What's the reproducibility here?
Sorry, could you
Oh, sorry,
explain
Sam.
again
Yeah.
what-
What was the
could you
question?
explain again why the zero field is the baseline for the CNN AE field?
Yeah. Okay. So Sam's question is, why is the zero field the baseline for the CNN AE field? And the zero field is the baseline for the CNN AE field because we don't know what the performance is like when those neurons are gone, when they're or electrodes, when those electrodes are completely gone. And so because we're using our model to fill back in this data, we need to understand what happened, like what is the performance when that data isn't even there.
Well, I think it's helpful just to think that comparing the shapes is useful in that way.
Yeah.
Right? So that's a direct contrast between the zero field and the CNN.
Well, yeah, so the shapes is more, the shapes tell you how much data have we deleted, but the colors tell you like the performance across conditions for zero filled versus.
Right, so looking at the 2 triangles. Or
Yeah,
the
yeah,
2
yeah.
squares will tell you something
Yes.
about performance versus baseline.
Right, right.
How many iterations are there? So each one is like, you try it once.
Yeah, okay, 1 second on that. Sam, does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, back to you.
How did the process go? I don't understand. So you do it once and just one time
Yeah.
you try it, you say like it was dropping like I don't know several times.
Right. Yeah, okay, so does everyone hear his question? Did everyone hear it? No? Okay, say it louder, maybe face back that way and tell people what you're asking.
No, you can repeat my question.
Okay, his question is like, how many times are we doing this? His question is like, where is the reproducibility? Like, what are we actually doing? Does that make sense? Do people see the reproducibility here or no? Okay, who sees it? Raise your hand. Who doesn't see it? Raise your hand. Okay, I like that you raised it high. That was good. Okay, who doesn't see it?
Because I don't see it.
Yeah, okay, you should all be raising your hand because I didn't show it to you. And this is a trick question. In this plot, there is no reproducibility, and that's because this isn't actually the full figure. And so this is the full figure, and I'm explaining it to you piecewise so that it can be digested. But basically what we're doing is, so here we're only plotting the means because we're actually plotting the averages across 5 different seeds of, well, it's more complicated, but we're plotting the averages of 5 different seeds of missing 50% or 70% or 90% across 3 different trained models that were trained across different seeds.
That's why numbers
Yes, and so that is why number 10, it looks like the blue is like for 50% and 70% is way higher than the yellow, but it's not like that, because when we actually do the pairwise difference, so by pairwise I mean for the same percentage of, or for the same exact like electrodes that are missing, when we compare like the 50% missing to 50% missing of zero filled and CNNAE filled, when we compare that pair, what we get is this, and you can actually see what the lines look like, and this tells you the variance. And so in these blue guys, here you can see, so basically in this plot, if we're above this line, this black line now means something different, there's a different legend, so this is the legend for this half of the plot. This black line tells you what equal performance is for your CNNAE filled model and for your zero filled model. And so if this variance line is above this blue line, it means that the CNNAE performs better, which is this green arrow. I don't know where my cursor went. The green arrow on the left. But if you're, yes?
So, but why wouldn't you be able to tell that from the first plot and the differences within the same shape?
Yes, okay, so the reason that you're not able to tell this, oh, there's my cursor. Okay, so the reason that you're not able to tell this in this plot is because we haven't plotted the variances. And the reason that we haven't plotted the variances is because in this plot, it's very hard to take the pairwise difference between like the seeds. So what we actually need to do is we need to do a pairwise comparison between like this specific 50% is missing in this 0%, and this specific 50% is missing in the CNNAE filled. And those have to be compared by pair. You can't just take the average across them and the average across, so the average across all the 5 seeds for 0 and the average across all the 5 seeds for CNNAE filled. Because that would lead to a situation that Lior showed you yesterday, where when you take averages across the data, it looks like the Democrats weren't as, they weren't as good for voting for civil rights as like the Republicans were. And that's why we're not plotting the variance in this plot, and we're plotting it pairwise in this plot. Does this make sense to people? Okay.
What does it mean that, why does patient number 10,
Yeah.
50% missing has such a big part? What does it mean about the data?
Yeah, so it means that in this case, there are certain electrodes that are going to have information about move rest. And when you delete those electrodes, you're going to have like drastically different performance. So for this patient, we would have to look at like where those electrodes are on the brain. But in the 50%, like I think, so this was 5 seeds worth of data. Perhaps in like 2 of those seeds, we deleted that group of electrodes that was actually important for this behavior. But in the other, I don't know, did I say 3 or 2? Whatever the other 5 is, we didn't delete them. And so there's actually this big variance there between like the electrodes that we have and the electrodes that we don't have, and how much of the move rest behavior do they capture. Does that make sense?
Maybe you have more important electrodes.
Yeah, so you might have more important electrodes in this patient.
So maybe these specific locations are actually better in a way.
Right. So that is one explanation for it. There are other explanations too. Like the model did not train, the model did. So with all of these, the models for each individual patient, so what you're actually looking at here is you're looking at 12 separate models that are plotted, because this plot is for the patient-specific models. What you're looking at is 12 different models for each, so one for each patient, and they've been run across multiple seeds. And we ran them for the same number of epochs, which you guys all know now. But perhaps for some patients, they should have been run like more epochs because they won't converge as quickly on those models. Yeah?
So why to run why running on a patient-specific one and not electrode-specific or
So
day-specific?
Yeah. So the goal with this paper was not to have like a day-specific model or an electrode-specific model. It was to have a patient-specific model. And then moreover, it was to have a joint patient model. So just based on like the goals of the paper. It's more like a machine learning modeling paper rather than like a science paper. Yeah. Because that's interesting to the modeling community, not so much like the downstream effects of like what electrodes are giving this behavior. Yeah. Okay, does this make sense to everyone? This idea that within these plots, whenever you're reading these plots, whether or not they be the more machine learning plots or the science plots, you're always going to see something about the ground truth, the baseline, and the reproducibility. And if you don't, you should be concerned. And moreover, when it comes to modeling, you should always be thinking about, okay, I have this model, I get this performance, what am I comparing it to? Like, what is the ground truth that I'm comparing it to? What is the baseline that I should be comparing it to? Like, it's irrelevant if your model performs at like 87% accuracy, but the baseline is like, 90% accuracy. Then like your model's actually performing worse than just your original data, or what your original data would lead you to get. So you should really think about all three of these when doing your model and going from that data processing to the model engineering. Okay, I think that those are all my slides. Do you guys have any additional questions? We good? Sam, do you have any questions?
I think I'm good.
Okay.
Just to,
Yeah.
the reproducibility is you run this,
Ye-
essentially did this performance calculation across multiple trials for multiple models.
Yeah, so do you see these variance lines in the plot
Yeah,
on the
yeah.
left? Yeah, so it's
Relative to the zero field.
yeah, so multiple different models that were run on multiple seeds, and then for each of those models that was run on a different seed, different situations of electrodes that were missing. So so like a model that was run on like seed 0 or whatever, we took 5 different portions of missing electrodes and saw that model's performance for those 5 different sets of missing electrodes. And then we did that for 3 different models. And then we took the average pairwise results from 0 field to the CNNAE.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, Nina.
So, just looking at the paper in my initial question, so I'm guessing the reason why you wanted to do a joint across participants is that different participants had electrodes in different locations? Is that why?
So the real reason that we wanted to model them all together is because we wanted to see what the representations would look like and whether or not it is possible. And if you look, I think it's figure 4 or 5, it's got like triangles in it, and you can see like the CNNAE, the mCNNAE, and the baseline that we created for it. It's like 4 different plots beside one another. So what you can do is you compare that top row to that bottom row, and you can see how does the performance change for the single participant model versus the joint participant model. And in that, I think it's, so the multi-participant model and CNNAE, they both do well compared to baseline. But I think especially in the 50% missing case which is the far right of the figure, the mCNNAE performs better for patient 1, but the CNNAE doesn't. So they have very similar representation, like they have very similar, not representations, they have very similar performance, and that is a good thing because we've demonstrated that we can take, let me actually go back. We've demonstrated that we can take, let me go back. We've demonstrated we can take a single model without giving any location information about the electrodes, and we can actually learn something across all 12 participants, which is very promising.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Okay. Does this make sense to everyone? More or less? All right, good. With that, what we're going to do is we're going to continue. If you guys are not done with data processing, that's fine. Feel free to keep going. If you want to move on to modeling, that's great, and start that. What I will say is if you aren't going to come to a spot where you need the TAs, but conversation with them is going to inform what you do a week from now, a month from now, a year from now, have those conversations with them and ask them how they would process your data or how they would model your data, because that's going to be very valuable. So use them while they're here. Okay, with that, please work.